She stood at the edge of the cell block, her hand trembling as she gripped a single photograph. The prisoner behind the bars had asked for one thing, just one thing: to deliver this photo to someone on the outside. But what Officer Sarah Mitchell didn't know yet was that the real message had nothing to do with what was captured in that image. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in photographs. They're hidden in the promises we make to deliver them. Sarah had been a corrections officer for 8 years at Oak Ridge Maximum Security Prison. 8 years of following protocol, 8 years of maintaining distance, 8 years of never getting involved. She had seen every manipulation tactic, every sob story, every desperate attempt to bend the rules, and she had resisted them all. Until the day prisoner 4782 called her over to his cell with a request so simple it seemed harmless. His name was Marcus Reeves, 43 years old, serving 25 to life for armed robbery and assault, a career criminal with a record that stretched back to his teenage years. But when he looked at Sarah through those bars, there was something different in his eyes. Not the usual hardness, not the calculated coldness she had learned to recognize. There was something that looked almost like genuine fear. He had been holding that photograph for 3 days. She had watched him stare at it during count, during meals, during the few hours of recreation time. He clutched it like it was the only thing tethering him to the world outside those concrete walls. And finally, on a Thursday evening, just before shift change, he asked her to approach. The photograph showed a young woman, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was sitting on a park bench, smiling at whoever was taking the picture. There was nothing remarkable about it. No hidden messages visible, no coded information. Just a woman on a bench. Marcus had explained that she was his daughter, that he hadn't seen her in 17 years, that she had finally agreed to meet him, but only if he could prove he still had this one photo. The photo from her 10th birthday, the last day they had spent together before everything fell apart. Sarah should have said no immediately. Protocol was clear. Officers don't deliver personal items. Officers don't become messengers. Officers maintain boundaries. But there was something about the way Marcus asked, the way his voice cracked just slightly when he said his daughter's name, Elena, the way he looked at that photograph like it was made of glass and might shatter if he held it too tightly. She told him she would think about it. That was her first mistake. Because thinking about it meant she was already considering it, and considering it meant the wall between professional duty and human compassion had already begun to crack. She went home that night and couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, about a father who hadn't seen his daughter in 17 years, about a daughter who was willing to give her father one more chance. The next morning, Sarah made her decision. She would deliver the photograph, just this once, just this one small act of humanity, in a place designed to strip humanity away. She told Marcus during morning rounds. She watched relief flood his face. He gave her an address, a coffee shop downtown. Elena would be there Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. All Sarah had to do was hand her the photograph and tell her that her father was ready, that he had changed, that he wanted a chance to explain. It seemed simple. It seemed safe. It seemed like the kind of small kindness that might actually matter in a world that often felt too hard and too cold. But Sarah Mitchell had no idea that she was about to become part of something much darker than a simple reunion between father and daughter. She had no idea that the photograph in her pocket was about to change everything. Not because of what it showed, but because of what delivering it would set in motion. Saturday arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. Sarah drove downtown, the photograph sealed in a small envelope. She felt nervous. Not because she thought she was doing anything wrong, but because she was crossing a line she had never crossed before. She was letting herself care. She was letting herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this one act could make a difference. The coffee shop was busy. Students with laptops, couples sharing pastries, the comfortable hum of normal life. Sarah spotted Elena immediately. She matched the photograph perfectly, just 17 years older. She sat alone at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. She was nervous too. Sarah approached. She introduced herself. She explained that she worked at the prison, that Marcus had asked her to deliver something. Elena's expression shifted, hope mixed with suspicion, longing mixed with anger. The complicated geography of a daughter trying to decide if her father deserved forgiveness. Sarah handed her the envelope. Elena opened it slowly. She pulled out the photograph and stared at it for a long moment. And then something strange happened. Elena looked up at Sarah with tears in her eyes. But they weren't tears of nostalgia. They weren't tears of reconciliation. They were tears of fear. Pure, undiluted fear. And she whispered 4 words that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. 4 words that made everything she thought she understood about this simple act of kindness completely unravel. She said, "He knows I'm alive. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you question everything you just heard." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at Elena, trying to process those 4 words. He knows I'm alive. What did that mean? Marcus knew his daughter was alive. Of course he did. That's why he had sent Sarah to find her. That's why he had given her the address. That's the entire reason they were sitting in this coffee shop. But the way Elena said it, the terror in her voice, the way her hands had started shaking. This wasn't the reaction of a daughter surprised by her father's awareness. This was the reaction of someone whose worst fear had just materialized. Sarah sat down without asking permission. Her training kicked in. Read the situation. Assess the threat. Understand what you're dealing with before you act. Elena was clutching the photograph so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her breathing was shallow. She kept glancing toward the door like she expected someone to burst through it at any moment. Sarah lowered her voice and asked the obvious question. "What do you mean he knows you're alive?" Elena's response came in fragments, broken pieces of a story that didn't make sense yet. She said her father wasn't supposed to know where she was, that she had disappeared 17 years ago on purpose, that the last time she saw him, the day that photograph was taken, was the day she had decided to vanish. She had been 10 years old. Her mother had helped her. They had left in the middle of the night, changed their names, moved to a different state, built entirely new lives. And they had done it because Marcus Reeves wasn't just a criminal. He was dangerous, specifically dangerous to them. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had delivered more than a photograph. She had delivered confirmation. Confirmation that Elena existed. Confirmation that she was in this city. Confirmation that she was real and findable. And Marcus had used her to do it. He had played on her compassion. He had calculated exactly which story would make her break protocol. A father missing his daughter? A daughter willing to give him one more chance. It was perfect bait, and Sarah had taken it completely. Elena explained through tears that her father had been looking for them for years, that even from prison he had ways of searching, connections, people on the outside who owed him favors. But her mother had been careful. They had stayed hidden. They had never left traces. Until now. Until Sarah had walked into this coffee shop and proven that Elena was real, that she was here, that after 17 years of silence, Marcus finally had a thread to pull. Sarah asked why. Why would a father hunt his own daughter? What had happened that was so terrible a mother would help her 10-year-old child disappear? Elena looked at the photograph again, at her younger self smiling on that park bench, at the moment frozen in time before everything shattered. And she said something that made Sarah's blood run cold. She said that her father had killed someone that day, that she had seen it happen, that she was the only witness who could prove it wasn't self-defense like he had claimed, that she was the reason his original sentence had been so light. The authorities had never found her, Marcus had told them his daughter and wife had left him months before the incident, that he had no idea where they were, that they weren't relevant to the case, and without Elena's testimony, the prosecution had accepted his plea deal. Assault instead of murder. 25 years instead of life without parole. But Marcus knew the truth. He knew that somewhere out there was a little girl who had watched him beat a man to death in an alley behind a liquor store. A little girl who could destroy his carefully constructed story if she ever came forward. Sarah tried to process this information. She was still wearing her uniform. She was still technically on duty, just on her lunch break. She had just helped a convicted felon locate a witness. No, not just a witness. A child witness who had been in hiding for nearly 2 decades. A witness whose testimony could reopen a closed case, could turn a manageable sentence into something much worse, could expose lies that Marcus had been protecting for 17 years. Elena kept talking. The words poured out like she had been holding them in for too long. She said she had tried to forget, that her mother had helped her build a new life, new name, new identity, new memories to replace the old ones. She had gone to college, built a career, met someone, got engaged. She was supposed to get married in 3 months. She had finally convinced herself that the past was dead, that Marcus would serve his time and she would never have to think about him again. But 6 months ago, something had changed. Elena started receiving messages, anonymous messages, nothing threatening at first, just questions. Someone asking if she remembered living in a different city, if she remembered a different name, if she remembered her father. She ignored them, blocked the numbers, changed her phone, but they kept coming. Different numbers, different email addresses, always the same questions, always circling closer to the truth she had buried. Then, 2 weeks ago, the messages stopped. Complete silence. Elena had felt relief. She thought maybe whoever was searching had given up, had moved on, had decided she wasn't worth finding. But now she understood. The messages had stopped because Marcus had succeeded. He had found her. He knew where she was. He knew what name she was using. He knew enough to send a corrections officer to a specific coffee shop at a specific time with a photograph that would prove his information was accurate. Sarah asked what was in the photograph. Why this particular image? What made it so important? Elena turned it over. On the back, in faded pencil, was a date and a location. October 14th, Riverside Park. The day of her 10th birthday. The day Marcus had killed someone. But that wasn't what made Sarah's hands go numb. What made her realize just how carefully Marcus had planned this entire thing was what else was written there. Below the date, in different handwriting, more recent, was an address. Not the coffee shop address. A different address. An address Sarah recognized immediately because she had seen it dozens of times on prison forms and visitor logs. It was Elena's current home address. Her real address, not some meeting place, not some neutral location. Marcus had somehow already known where she lived. The photograph wasn't about finding her. It was about proving that he had already found her. It was about sending a message, and he had used Sarah to deliver it. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. She said there was more. Something she hadn't told anyone. Not her mother, not her fiancé, not the therapist she had seen for years trying to process childhood trauma. Something about that day in the alley. Something about what she had witnessed. Something that made Marcus's determination to find her make terrible, perfect sense. But before she could explain, before Sarah could ask, Elena's phone buzzed on the table between them. A text message. From an unknown number. 3 words. Just 3 words that made Elena's face go completely white. Made her stand up so fast her chair fell backward. Made her grab her coat and start moving toward the door without explanation. Sarah caught her arm and demanded to know what the message said. Elena showed her the screen, the 3 words that changed everything. Sarah thought she understood about this situation. The message said, "Thank you, officer." Sarah's mind spiraled. The message wasn't from Elena's phone. It was from someone else. Someone who had been watching. Someone who knew exactly what had just happened in that coffee shop. Someone who had been monitoring the situation the entire time. But how? How could Marcus know what was happening right now? He was locked behind reinforced steel doors miles away from this location. He couldn't have eyes on them. He couldn't have orchestrated this timing so precisely. Unless he had help. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belt where her radio hung. Standard protocol. Report the situation. Call for backup. Notify her supervisors that a prisoner had violated terms of communication and potentially orchestrated a criminal act from inside the facility. But something stopped her. A voice in the back of her mind that sounded like her own conscience but felt increasingly like doubt. If she reported this now, she would have to admit what she had done. She would have to confess that she had broken protocol, that she had become a tool in Marcus's plan, that she had betrayed her badge, her duty, and the trust placed in her as a corrections officer. Elena was already moving toward the door. Sarah followed, her uniform drawing stares from other customers. A prison guard in full gear chasing a woman through a coffee shop. It looked like an arrest. It felt like a failure. Elena hit the street and started walking fast, not running, but moving with urgent purpose. She kept her head down and her pace steady. Sarah caught up and grabbed her elbow. Elena jerked away but didn't stop walking. Sarah demanded answers. Who sent that message? How could Marcus contact people from inside a maximum security facility? Elena's response was bitter and frightened in equal measure. She said Marcus had connections. That even locked away, he had influence. That the criminal world didn't respect prison walls the way law enforcement did. There were guards who could be bought. Inmates with outside contacts who owed Marcus favors from decades of gang affiliations. Mail systems that could be compromised. Phone calls that could be rerouted. Prison wasn't isolation anymore. For someone like Marcus, it was just a different headquarters. But that wasn't even the worst part, Elena said. The worst part was that Marcus wasn't trying to hurt her. Not yet. He was trying to tell her something. The message made that clear. Thank you, officer. Those words weren't a threat. They were confirmation. They were acknowledgement. Marcus was letting Elena know that she had delivered on her part of whatever bargain she apparently didn't know she had made. And now, he was going to deliver on his. Sarah's guilt was metastasizing into something darker. Something that felt like complicity. She had become part of this story without understanding the plot, without reading the full script. And now someone else had written her dialogue for her. She had played her part perfectly. The sympathetic officer. The one who bent the rules for compassion. The one who could be manipulated into breaking protocol. And Marcus had known exactly how to cast her in this role. Elena finally stopped walking. She pulled Sarah into a small bookstore, away from the street, away from potential observation. They stood in the poetry section, surrounded by words about love and loss and longing. And Elena finally told Sarah the truth about that day 17 years ago. The truth about why she had run. The truth about what she had witnessed in that alley. Marcus hadn't just killed someone. He had killed someone important, someone connected, someone whose death would have serious consequences. The man's name was David Chen. He was a mid-level distributor in the city's organized crime network. He was connected to people with real power. People who didn't forgive debt. People who didn't accept excuses. And Marcus had beaten him to death over a drug deal gone wrong. But here's where the story became complicated. Here's where the lines between victim and perpetrator started to blur. Elena had watched from the edge of the alley. She was supposed to be getting ice cream with her mother, but Marcus had asked her to come with him instead. He had said it would be quick. He said he just needed to talk to someone about money. A child's logic accepts these explanations without question. So she followed. and she saw everything. What she saw was David Chen attacking Marcus first. She saw him pull a knife. She saw him slash at Marcus's face, drawing blood. She saw Marcus defending himself. And then she saw Marcus continue long after the threat was neutralized. She saw her father's hands become weapons. She saw rage overtake reason. She saw the moment self-defense became murder. That moment had split her life into before and after. But there was a detail that Elena had never told anyone. A detail that her 10-year-old mind had registered but not fully understood. And that detail was the reason Marcus had been looking for her all these years. That detail was why he had orchestrated this elaborate scheme. That detail was why he had asked Sarah to deliver that specific photograph with that specific date and location written on the back. There had been another witness that day, not just Elena. Someone else who had seen what happened. Someone else who knew that it was self-defense mixed with overkill. Someone else who knew that Marcus had a legitimate claim to have been attacked first. And that witness hadn't come forward. The authorities had never found them. The case had been decided based on incomplete information, and Marcus had spent 17 years in prison wondering if that other witness would ever expose the truth. Wondering if they were alive. Wondering if they remembered. And here's what made Sarah's stomach drop. Here's what made her realize just how deep she was in this situation. Elena said that the other witness had been a young guard, a newly hired corrections officer who had been working at a nearby facility at the time. Someone who had seen the incident from a distance, but had never come forward because they were afraid. Afraid of getting involved. Afraid of retribution. Afraid of the criminal underworld's reach. Sarah asked the obvious question. What was that guard's name? And Elena looked at her with an expression that mixed pity and horror in equal measure. She said she didn't know the name, but she knew something else. She knew that guard had eventually transferred to Oak Ridge Maximum Security Prison. She knew that guard had been working there for years, rising through the ranks, building a career while carrying a secret. And she suspected, based on everything Marcus had done, that guard might be someone Sarah knew very well. Sarah felt the walls of the bookstore close in. Elena was suggesting something impossible, something that made her question her own understanding of her workplace, her colleagues, her friends. She asked Elena if she was saying that Marcus had found this witness, had confirmed their identity, had used them as leverage to get Sarah to deliver this photograph. Elena shook her head. She said she wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. That message, "Thank you, officer," wasn't just directed at Sarah. It was a message to someone else, someone inside the prison system who had helped Marcus orchestrate this entire plan, someone who had been waiting for this moment, someone who owed Marcus something, or owed him an explanation. And now, with Sarah's help, Marcus had proven that he could reach people, that he had influence, that even locked away, he was a force to be reckoned with. Sarah's radio crackled to life. A call from the prison. The message was simple and routine. Officer needed for an urgent matter in the administrative wing. Standard language, nothing suspicious. But Sarah's hands were shaking as she held the radio. She knew what she was being called for. She knew that Marcus wanted to see her, wanted to look her in the eyes, wanted to confirm that his plan had worked, that she had delivered the photograph, that Elena was now terrified, that the dominoes were falling exactly as he had arranged. Elena grabbed Sarah's hand. She said Sarah shouldn't go back. That going back meant walking into something dangerous. But Sarah knew she had no choice. She was already compromised. She was already part of this story. And the only way to understand what was really happening was to face it directly, to look Marcus in the eye and demand the truth. She told Elena to go home, lock the doors, tell her fiancé everything, contact the authorities, go into protective custody if necessary. But Elena shook her head. She said the authorities couldn't help, that if Marcus had influence inside the prison system, He had influence everywhere. That running wouldn't work. That the only way this ended was if the truth came out. All of it. Every secret. Every hidden witness. Every protected lie. And that truth was buried inside a locked cell with a man who had orchestrated his own daughter's discovery with the precision of a master strategist. Sarah drove back to Oak Ridge with her mind racing. She replayed every interaction with Marcus, every seemingly innocent conversation, every request that seemed small and reasonable. She had been played, but she had also been used. And somewhere in the difference between those two things was a man who understood manipulation so deeply that he could orchestrate entire lives from inside a prison cell. As she pulled into the parking lot, Sarah noticed something she had never paid attention to before. There was a surveillance camera aimed directly at the guard entrance, the same entrance where inmates and officers passed every single day, the same entrance where Marcus had been escorted in for his intake 8 years ago. If that camera had footage going back far enough, someone could identify the officer who had been on duty that day. Someone could prove that officer had been at Oak Ridge when Marcus arrived. Someone could connect those dots. Sarah walked into the building. Her badge felt heavier than usual. Her uniform felt like a costume. She was about to enter a room with a man who had manipulated her into breaking the fundamental rules of her profession. And she was about to learn that the violations she had already committed were going to look insignificant compared to what was about to be revealed. The administrative wing was quiet. Too quiet. Sarah had been summoned by a supervisor, but when she arrived at the office, there was no supervisor waiting. Instead, there was a different guard she vaguely recognized. Someone from the night shift. Someone whose name she couldn't quite remember. He told her that Marcus had requested a transfer to the medical wing, that he claimed to be having chest pains, that he needed to be evaluated, and they needed Sarah to escort him. Sarah's instincts screamed that something was wrong. Medical transfers happened through standard channels. They didn't require specific officer requests. But when she questioned the guard, he simply handed her the paperwork. All signed. All approved. All official. She had no legitimate reason to refuse. So she walked to the cell block and found Marcus sitting on his bunk, waiting, as if he had known exactly when she would arrive. Marcus stood when he saw her. He was a man in his mid-40s with gray threading through his dark hair. Prison had aged him in ways that went beyond years. His face carried the weight of consequences, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. They looked at Sarah with an intensity that made her realize she had never really seen him before. She had seen what she wanted to see. A desperate father. A man seeking redemption. A human being asking for one small kindness. He asked her to walk with him, not as an order, but as a request. And because everything about her training told her not to, because every instinct she had developed over 8 years in corrections screamed that this was a violation of protocol, Sarah found herself walking beside him through the corridors of Oak Ridge Maximum Security Prison with no other guards present. No witnesses, no backup. Just two people who had been brought together by a carefully orchestrated plan. Marcus started talking as they walked. He didn't look at her. He looked ahead, down the long hallway, as if he was seeing something beyond the concrete walls. He said he appreciated what she had done, that she had proven herself to be exactly the kind of person he had identified her as. Compassionate, naive, willing to bend rules for human connection. He said those qualities weren't weaknesses. They were strengths in a world that had become too cold, too mechanical, too willing to abandon people to systems that didn't care if they lived or died. Sarah demanded to know what was really happening. Why he had orchestrated this elaborate scheme. Why he had manipulated her. Why he was talking to her like they were friends. Marcus stopped walking. He turned to face her, and he said something that made her blood run cold. He said that Sarah hadn't just helped him find Elena. She had helped him find the truth. and the truth was much bigger than a photograph, much more complicated than a simple reunion between father and daughter. He told her that there had been another witness to the incident with David Chen all those years ago. That witness had been there because they were on duty, because they were working a detail nearby. That witness had seen the altercation start, had seen David Chen pull a knife, had seen Marcus fighting for his life. But that witness had also seen something else, something that would have changed everything if they had come forward. Marcus said that David Chen wasn't just a criminal. He was connected to people inside the police department, powerful people, people who didn't want certain information becoming public. So when David Chen ended up dead, and when it became clear that Marcus was going to take the fall, those powerful people made a decision. They decided that Marcus's conviction was acceptable, that a 25-year sentence was a reasonable price for making sure David Chen's connections stayed buried. The witness had been told, in no uncertain terms, that coming forward would be hazardous to their health, that staying silent was the smart choice, that cooperating with authorities would result in consequences far worse than prison. So the witness had stayed silent, had built a career, had moved up the ranks, had tried to forget. But Marcus had never forgotten, and he had spent 17 years in prison planning how to bring that truth to the surface. Sarah asked who the witness was. Marcus smiled, a sad smile that carried the weight of years. He said the witness was someone Sarah worked with, someone she saw every single day, someone she trusted, someone who had carried the burden of that secret for so long that it had become part of their identity. And then Marcus told her the name. It was Deputy Warden Thomas Garrett. Sarah felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Deputy Warden Garrett was one of the most respected officers in the facility. He had been working in corrections for over 20 years. He had written the training manual that every new officer studied. He had mentored dozens of guards, including Sarah. He was the kind of man who seemed to embody everything good about law enforcement. The kind of man who made you believe in the system. And he had been lying about what he knew for nearly 2 decades. Marcus continued walking, and Sarah followed in a daze. He said that Garrett had been approaching retirement, that Garrett had been planning to leave the system with a clean record and a comfortable pension. But Marcus had found a way to communicate with Garrett, had sent him a message, had given him an ultimatum. Either Garrett would help Marcus locate Elena, or Marcus would come forward with his own testimony about what really happened that day. Either Garrett would help expose the truth about David Chen's connections to corrupt police officers, or Marcus would go to the authorities himself and confirm Garrett's involvement in the cover-up. It was blackmail, pure and simple. Marcus had orchestrated Elena's discovery as a way to force Garrett's hand. Garrett had used his connections inside the system to identify Elena's location. Garrett had been the one to send anonymous messages. Garrett had been the one watching. And when Garrett realized that Marcus's plan was accelerating, that the time for action was approaching, Garrett had done something desperate. Garrett had reached out to someone he trusted, a young officer who showed promise, an officer who had caught his attention, an officer who reminded him of himself, an officer named Sarah Mitchell. Garrett had told Sarah a story about a prisoner with a genuine need, a prisoner who simply wanted to reconnect with his daughter, a prisoner who was reformed and seeking redemption. And Garrett had suggested that showing compassion might be exactly what that prisoner needed to truly change. Sarah realized then that she hadn't acted on her own. She had been guided, directed, manipulated by someone she respected into becoming part of a scheme that was much larger than she understood. Garrett had used her to do what he couldn't do himself. He had used her to deliver the final piece of Marcus's plan. The confirmation that Elena existed, the proof that Marcus could reach her, the evidence that Garrett still had power and influence even as retirement approached. Marcus explained that the next step was already in motion, that by delivering the photograph, Sarah had triggered a sequence of events that would force Garrett to act. Garrett would have to come clean about what he knew, or Garrett would have to silence Marcus permanently. One way or another, the truth was coming out, and Sarah was going to be at the center of it. They had reached the medical wing. A doctor was waiting. Not the usual prison doctor. Someone different. Someone who looked at Sarah with recognition that suggested she wasn't there by accident. The doctor took Marcus's vitals without any of the usual procedures, without any actual examination. And then he declared that Marcus was fine, that the chest pains had subsided, that Marcus could return to his cell. But as Marcus turned to leave, he looked at Sarah one final time. He said something that would echo through every moment that followed. He said, "Officer Mitchell, you need to ask yourself one important question. If Deputy Warden Garrett was willing to compromise his entire career to protect a secret, what else is he willing to do to keep that secret buried? And now that you know what he did, now that you're a liability, don't you wonder what he might do to protect himself?" Sarah stood frozen as Marcus walked back toward his cell. The implications of his words were spreading through her mind like poison. She had walked into a prison, and she had walked out into a different kind of trap. A trap where the hunter and the hunted had switched places, where the man behind bars had more power than the woman with the keys, where the real prison wasn't built from steel and concrete, but from secrets and complicity, and the terrible knowledge that someone she trusted had been lying to her face for years. Her radio crackled to life. Another message, this time from Deputy Warden Garrett himself. He was asking for her to come to his office, right away, alone. The message was casual, professional, routine. But Sarah understood now that nothing was routine, that every interaction had been calculated, that every moment had been leading to this point, where she would have to look into the eyes of a man she had respected and see him for what he really was. A man willing to commit crimes to protect secrets. A man who had used her. A man who was now trapped between the truth and his survival. And as Sarah walked toward Garrett's office, she realized something that made her blood run cold. Garrett wasn't the hunter in this situation either. He was just another trapped animal. And Marcus, locked away in his cell, was pulling every string, playing every player, moving every piece on the board with the precision of a master strategist who had spent 17 years planning for this exact moment. The question wasn't what Garrett would do to protect himself. The question was what Sarah would do, now that she understood the truth about all of them. Deputy Warden Garrett's office was exactly what Sarah had always remembered it to be. Neat, professional, lined with commendations and photographs of Garrett shaking hands with various officials and dignitaries, a shrine to a career built on integrity. Or so she had thought. Garrett sat behind his desk, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't stand to greet her. He didn't offer her a chair. He simply looked at her with an intensity that suggested he had been expecting this conversation for a long time. Sarah closed the door behind her, locked it. Garrett watched without comment. She said his name, just his name, Thomas. It was the first time she had ever addressed him so informally. The first time she had broken the professional distance that existed between supervisor and subordinate. And in that single word, she was asking him to explain everything, to justify the unjustifiable, to make sense of the impossible. Garrett stood and walked to the window that overlooked the prison grounds. He looked out at the fences and the guard towers and the endless concrete. He looked like a man seeing his entire world through different eyes. He said, "I wondered how long it would take before you figured it out. I wondered if you would come to me first or if you would go straight to the authorities." He didn't turn around. He just kept staring out at the prison that had been both his career and his cage. Sarah demanded the truth. The complete truth. Not the fragments Marcus had given her, not the implications and the threats. The actual truth about what happened that day with David Chen. About why Garrett had stayed silent. About why he had helped Marcus find Elena. about why he had manipulated Sarah into being part of this elaborate scheme. Garrett finally turned around. And when he did, Sarah saw something she had never seen in him before. She saw fear, real, bone-deep fear. The kind of fear that comes from carrying a secret for so long that it has become the only thing holding you together. Garrett said, "I didn't help Marcus find Elena. Marcus found her himself. What I did was I didn't stop him." He paused. He walked back to his desk and sat down heavily. There's a difference between those two things, and that difference is the thing that has been eating me alive for the last 6 months. He explained that Marcus had been communicating with people on the outside for years, through channels that existed in every prison, through inmates with outside connections, through visitors who carried messages, through letters written in code. Garrett had known about these communications. It was his job to know about them, but he had never reported them. He had simply looked the other way. "Why?" Sarah asked. "Because," Garrett said, "I owed him." The story that followed was different from the one Marcus had told. It was the same events but seen through different eyes. Garrett had been a young police officer when David Chen died. He had been working a detail in the neighborhood. He had heard the commotion in the alley. He had arrived just as Marcus was beating David Chen's body. He had witnessed the aftermath, the rage, the blood, the moment when a man loses control completely. But here's what Marcus hadn't mentioned. Here's what changed everything. Garrett hadn't been a random witness. Garrett had been there because David Chen had a connection to Garrett's family. Garrett's younger brother, Danny, had been dating David Chen's sister, and David Chen had disapproved. David Chen had made it clear through violence and intimidation that Danny needed to end the relationship. David Chen had broken Danny's arm to make his point, and Danny had gone to Garrett in tears. Garrett had arranged to meet David Chen in that alley. Garrett had intended to warn him, to tell him to back off, to make it clear that there would be consequences if he continued to hurt Danny's girlfriend. But when Garrett arrived at the alley, Marcus was already there. Marcus had been hired by someone to collect a debt from David Chen. The debt had nothing to do with Garrett or Danny. It was part of a larger criminal operation. Marcus had confronted David Chen. David Chen had pulled a knife, and in the chaos that followed, Garrett had watched. He had watched Marcus defend himself. He had watched Marcus continue long after the threat had ended. And he had made a decision. He had called in a report saying he had been delayed, that he had arrived at the alley after the incident had already concluded, that he had found David Chen dead and Marcus standing over him. He had lied on the official record, but he hadn't lied because he was protecting Marcus. He had lied because he was protecting himself. Because if David Chen's death was investigated thoroughly, if the connections became public, if people started asking questions about why a police officer was meeting with a known gang associate in an alley at midnight, Garrett's career would have been over before it started. So he had fabricated evidence. He had omitted details. He had ensured that the investigation took a specific path that led to Marcus's conviction. Marcus had known, years later, that Garrett had lied, through conversations with other inmates, through connections that operated in the criminal underworld. Marcus had understood that Garrett had sacrificed him to protect his own career, and instead of seeking revenge, Marcus had decided to use that knowledge as leverage. He had decided that one day, when the moment was right, he would cash in that debt. Sarah felt the room spinning. She had thought this story was about a father seeking redemption. It was actually about manipulation and revenge. It was about a man who had spent 17 years in prison planning how to extract payment from someone who had wronged him. It was about Garrett being forced to help Marcus destroy his own cover-up. It was about Sarah being caught in the middle of a game where all the players were guilty of something. But then Garrett said something that stopped Sarah's spiraling thoughts completely. He said, "Marcus didn't just want me to help find Elena. He wanted me to help him do something much worse." Garrett opened his desk drawer. He pulled out a file. He slid it across the desk to Sarah. He wanted me to help him prove that David Chen's death wasn't just self-defense. He wanted me to help him prove that it was justified, that David Chen deserved what happened to him. Sarah opened the file. Inside were photographs, documents, records, evidence that David Chen had been connected to a network of corrupt police officers who were involved in drug trafficking. Evidence that David Chen had been using intimidation and violence to expand that network. Evidence that several of those corrupt officers were still working in law enforcement. Evidence that had been suppressed. Evidence that had been hidden. Evidence that could destroy careers and send people to prison. Marcus wants immunity, Garrett said quietly, in exchange for his testimony about David Chen and the corruption network. Marcus wants a significantly reduced sentence, and he wants Elena to be safe. He wants her name removed from any reports. He wants guarantee of protection. He wants his daughter to have a future that isn't shadowed by this. Sarah looked at Garrett. "So you're going to help him?" "I'm going to have to," Garrett said. "If I don't, he'll release this information himself. And when he does, he'll make sure everyone knows that I was part of the cover-up, that I fabricated evidence, that I helped protect corrupt officers, that I sacrificed an innocent man's freedom to protect my own career." Garrett's voice cracked. "And he's right. That's exactly what I did. And I've known it for 17 years. Sarah sat down. All the air left her body. She understood now what had really happened. Marcus hadn't been manipulating her out of cruelty. He had been using her because he had no other options. He had been trapped in a situation where the only way forward was to force people to confront the truth. The only way to protect his daughter was to expose the men who would hunt her. The only way to escape his sentence was to become useful to the system that had condemned him. And Sarah had been the tool that made it possible. She had been the one person innocent enough, compassionate enough, that she could be trusted to deliver the photograph without suspicion. She had been the one person who could confirm to everyone involved that the plan was working. She had been essential to everything that followed. Garrett looked at Sarah with eyes full of regret. "I'm going to confess everything tomorrow," he said. "I'm going to go to the authorities. I'm going to explain what I did. I'm going to explain how Marcus discovered the evidence about the corruption network. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life understanding the consequences of decisions I made when I was young and afraid." "And Marcus?" Sarah asked. "Marcus is going to testify," Garrett said. "And Marcus is going to walk out of here with a new identity and a chance at a life with his daughter. Because that's the price of justice sometimes. Sometimes the guilty get lighter sentences because their testimony can expose larger truths." Sarah realized then that she had been wrong about everything. She had thought Marcus was the villain orchestrating events from his cell. But Marcus had been the victim in this story. Victim to Garrett's ambition. Victim to a corrupt system that had sacrificed him to protect powerful people. Victim to 17 years of imprisonment for a crime that was far more complicated than the verdict suggested. "What about Elena?" Sarah asked. "What does she think about all this?" "Elena doesn't know yet," Garrett said. "She just knows that her father has been looking for her. She doesn't know why. She doesn't know that the entire reason Marcus reached out was to protect her. To make sure that when everything came to light, she wouldn't be dragged into the investigation. She was supposed to be safe. She was supposed to never know that any of this happened." Sarah stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the prison grounds. Somewhere in those cells, Marcus was sitting in his bunk, waiting for the next phase of his plan to unfold. Somewhere out there, Elena was terrified and confused, not understanding that the man hunting her had actually been trying to save her. Somewhere in this facility, there were officers who had known about the corruption and done nothing. Officers who would now face exposure. Officers who would go to prison. And Sarah, Officer Sarah Mitchell, was standing in the middle of all of it. She had become part of a story much larger than herself. She had been used to deliver truth. She had been manipulated into becoming an instrument of justice, even though she had started the day believing she was simply delivering a photograph. Garrett said, "I'm sorry I brought you into this. I'm sorry I used you. I'm sorry that you're going to have to go to the authorities now and explain your role in all of this. You broke protocol. You could face disciplinary action. You could face charges. But I want you to know that you didn't do anything wrong. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You were compassionate to someone in need. And sometimes that compassion requires us to break rules that were designed to protect people in power." Sarah turned to look at Garrett, and in that moment, she saw something unexpected. She saw a man coming to the end of a long journey. A man who had spent 17 years protecting secrets and suddenly had the opportunity to tell the truth. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't hers to give, but she understood him. And understanding, she was beginning to realize, was the first step toward justice. Sarah walked out of Garrett's office and found herself standing in the corridor of Oak Ridge Maximum Security Prison, as if seeing it for the first time. Everything was the same. The concrete walls, the fluorescent lights, the sound of distant voices echoing through metal and stone. But everything was different. She was no longer a corrections officer simply doing her job. She was a witness to something much larger, a participant in a transformation that would reshape lives and expose truths that powerful people had spent decades burying. She made the call that same night, to the state police, to the federal bureau, to prosecutors who specialized in corruption cases. She reported what Garrett had told her. She provided the file with the evidence. She explained her role in delivering the photograph. She confessed to breaking protocol. And then she waited for the machinery of justice to begin moving. It moved slowly at first, then faster. Then, with the force of something that had been compressed for too long and suddenly found release. Within a week, Deputy Warden Garrett was arrested. Within 2 weeks, 3 other corrections officers were taken into custody on corruption charges. Within a month, the investigation had expanded to include police officers outside the facility. Evidence of drug trafficking, evidence of protection rackets, evidence of systematic abuse of power. All of it traced back to connections that David Chen had made 17 years ago. All of it waiting to be exposed as soon as someone was willing to speak truth. Marcus was offered a deal, 20 years instead of 25. Immediate possibility of parole eligibility. Full immunity in exchange for testimony. He accepted without hesitation. He had spent 17 years in prison not to serve his sentence, but to serve a larger purpose. He had used his time to gather intelligence, to understand the system, to identify the weak points, to plan the moment when he could force the truth into the light. Elena received a call from her father for the first time in 17 years. Not in person, not in a visitation room, but through an official channel, with lawyers present and federal agents listening. Marcus told her the truth about that day in the alley. He told her about David Chen pulling a knife. He told her about defending himself. He told her about the witness who had lied to protect himself. He told her that he had spent 17 years in prison not because of what he had done, but because of what someone else had failed to do. And then he told her something that made Elena weep. He told her that he had orchestrated his own daughter's discovery not to hurt her, but to protect her. That he had forced Garrett to help locate her because he wanted to ensure that when everything came to light, she would be safe. That he wanted her to understand the truth before the media discovered it. That he wanted her to know that the man in the prison cell was not a monster. He was a man who had been trapped by circumstances and had used his time to expose the people who had trapped him. Elena asked if she could see him. Marcus said yes. But he said it should wait. Wait until the trial. Wait until his testimony. Wait until the truth was public. Wait until he could walk out of that prison, knowing that he had paid his debt to society and done something that mattered. Wait until he could look his daughter in the eyes, without the weight of secrets standing between them. Sarah testified at the trial. She explained her role in delivering the photograph. She admitted to breaking protocol. but she also explained why. She talked about Marcus's request as a human being asking for compassion. She talked about Garrett's manipulation and how she had been used without her knowledge. She talked about the moment when everything changed, when she understood that the story she thought she was telling was actually a very different story. The prosecutor asked her if she regretted her actions. Sarah said no. She said that breaking the rules was sometimes the only way truth could emerge from systems designed to protect power. The defense attorney asked her if she believed Marcus Reeves was guilty of the charges he had originally been convicted of. Sarah said she believed that Marcus had killed David Chen, but she also believed that David Chen had attacked first. She believed that Marcus had used excessive force, but she also believed that excessive force in self-defense was not the same as murder. She believed that the original conviction had been based on incomplete evidence and deliberate omissions, and she believed that justice required acknowledging all of those things simultaneously. Marcus testified. He explained everything. He talked about that day in the alley. He talked about the rage and the fear and the moment when survival instinct overtook reason. He talked about watching Garrett lie on the witness stand. He talked about spending 17 years in a cell knowing that the man who had condemned him was walking free. He talked about his daughter growing up in hiding. He talked about the moment when he realized that the only way to change anything was to force the system to confront its own corruption. The prosecution presented evidence, document after document, photograph after photograph, testimony after testimony. The corruption network unraveled like a thread being pulled from the bottom of a sweater. Officers confessed. Deals were made. People went to prison. And through it all, the central truth remained constant. David Chen had died in an alley 17 years ago, and that death had triggered a chain of events that eventually exposed a system that had been designed to protect the guilty. Marcus was released after serving 4 years of his reduced sentence. He walked out of Oak Ridge Maximum Security Prison on a gray morning with the sky hanging low and heavy. Elena was waiting for him outside the gates. She was 32 years old now. She had called off her engagement. She had told her fiancé everything, and she had decided that before she could build a new life, she needed to understand her old one. They embraced. No words were necessary. They were no longer a father and daughter separated by 17 years and a photograph. They were two people who had survived a system designed to break them. Two people who had been separated by injustice and brought back together through truth. Two people who understood that forgiveness wasn't something that happened in a moment. It was something that happened over time, through small acts of grace and understanding. Sarah received a commendation from the state police for her role in exposing the corruption network. She also received a formal reprimand from the corrections department for breaking protocol. The two things existed simultaneously: justice and consequence, praise and punishment. She had done the right thing and violated the rules to do it. And she had learned that sometimes those two things were inseparable. She continued working at Oak Ridge, but something had changed inside her. She understood now that the prison wasn't just a place where the guilty were held. It was also a place where people could be destroyed by systems that didn't care about truth. It was a place where secrets accumulated like sediment. It was a place where a single act of compassion could trigger an avalanche of consequences. 1 year after Marcus's release, Sarah received a letter. It was from Elena. Elena wrote about her father's adjustment to life outside the prison. She wrote about the difficulties, the parole restrictions, the challenges of rebuilding a relationship that had been frozen in time. She wrote about the progress, the conversations that lasted until late at night, the moment when Marcus had held her while she wept for the childhood they had lost. And then Elena wrote something that made Sarah's heart ache. She wrote that her father had told her about Officer Sarah Mitchell, about the woman who had broken protocol because she believed compassion was more important than rules, about the woman who had helped trigger the events that freed him. Elena wrote that she wanted Sarah to know something. She wanted Sarah to understand that the act of delivering that photograph had changed more than just their lives. It had changed the system. It had exposed corruption. It had proven that truth could emerge even from the most constrained circumstances. But Elena also wrote something else. She wrote that her father wanted her to tell Sarah something. Marcus wanted Sarah to know that he was sorry. He was sorry that he had used her. He was sorry that he had manipulated her compassion. He was sorry that he had put her in a position where she had to break rules to do the right thing. But he was also grateful. Grateful that she had been the kind of person who would break rules for compassion. Grateful that she was the kind of officer who still believed in justice, instead of just procedure. Elena's letter ended with a question. She asked if Sarah would be willing to meet them. Not at the prison, not in an official capacity. Just 3 people who had been brought together by extraordinary circumstances. Just 3 people who had each played a role in a story that was much larger than any of them. Sarah sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the day she had delivered a simple photograph and walked into something far more complex. She thought about Garrett's confession. She thought about Marcus's testimony. She thought about Elena's pain and her father's determination to protect her. And she realized something that made everything make sense. She realized that this story wasn't really about crime or corruption or justice. It was about the choices we make when we are forced to decide between rules and truth. It was about what we risk to protect the people we love. It was about the way a single act of compassion can ripple outward and change lives in ways we never could have predicted. Sarah wrote back to Elena. She said yes. She said she would meet them. She said that she wanted to know the rest of their story. The part that happens after the trial, after the conviction, after the release. The part where people who have been broken try to put themselves back together. The part where a father and daughter try to rebuild a relationship that was shattered before it fully formed. When they finally met, it was at a coffee shop. Not the same coffee shop where Sarah had met Elena to deliver the photograph. A different place. A neutral place. A place where 3 people who had been brought together by manipulation and truth could finally just be human beings. Marcus looked different without the prison uniform. He looked smaller somehow, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, intelligent, still calculating, but no longer manipulating, just observing, just understanding. Elena was different too. The fear was gone from her face. She still carried the weight of what had happened, but she was no longer being hunted by it. She was no longer a victim in hiding. She was a woman who had reclaimed her power by facing the truth. And Sarah understood, sitting across from them, that the real reversal in this story wasn't about discovering that Marcus was innocent or that Garrett was guilty. The real reversal was about discovering that justice could emerge from the most corrupted systems if someone was willing to break the rules to expose the truth. The real reversal was about learning that compassion and protocol don't always align, and sometimes you have to choose which one matters more. Marcus looked at Sarah and said, "Thank you," not for delivering the photograph. He thanked her for being willing to see past her uniform, for seeing the human being beneath the protocol, for being brave enough to question the system that had trained her. Elena reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. No words were necessary. They understood each other now. They understood that this story was never really about a single photograph. It was always about the moment when someone decides that truth is worth the cost of breaking the rules to expose it. As Sarah left the coffee shop that day, she understood that her life had been divided into before and after. Before the photograph, after the photograph. And somewhere in between those 2 moments, she had discovered who she really was. Not an officer following protocol, but a person willing to choose compassion even when it meant breaking the rules. Not a pawn in someone else's game, but a player with her own agency who had helped move the world toward justice, even when it cost her everything. The story didn't end there. The story continues every single day in the choices we make. In the moments when we decide whether to follow the rules or follow our hearts. In the moments when we decide whether to protect the system or protect the truth. In the moments when we understand that sometimes the most powerful act we can perform is simply to break the rule that should never have existed in the first place.